So I'll share my screen very quickly. Please let me know if you can see my screen as it comes up. Can anyone see my screen? Please let me know.
We can, ma'am.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's jump right into it. The anchor had, spoken briefly about, but just to introduce myself a little bit more to build engagement. So I run a consulting outfit called People Plus Consulting, which I started 2022. Before that, I worked with PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big four, as a management consultant in the people and organization advisory practice. So that was my exposure into the consulting space. But prior to that, I had hands-on HR experience working at the Lagos Business School. Aside from my core HR engagements, I commit myself to different courses that promote education because I've become passionate about education over the years. In my sojourn in HR, in hiring, recruiting, particularly when I was at PwC, I observed that people who make it to the finals in the recruitment process either went to a private university or schooled outside Nigeria. So that got me thinking about our education system in Nigeria. How do we derive more value, in terms of outcome and quality? So that has led me to devote myself to courses that promote education. All right, I sit on the board of St. Xavier's School in Butemeta, and a training academy called AnyPro. I also serve as a mentor with Wingbees and Teach for Nigeria Foundation and the full-time MBA of Lagos Business School. Okay, I think there's some noise in my background. Let me try. Sorry for that break. There was some noise in my background. All right, so like I said, I volunteer for different courses that promote education. I'm a certified management trainer with National Council for Management Development and a whole certifications in HR practice. So that's me in a nutshell. I always like to know my audience, particularly around your expectations. When you were told there's a webinar on talent management, talent engagement, what were your thoughts? So in the chat box, please just drop your name, what you do, your expectations for this session, and a fun fact about you. We're talking about engagement, so it's also important we engage. And engagement starts with knowing you, all right? So that when we go into the topic of conversation, and we are talking about you engaging your employee, starts with you knowing them. It is only the person you know you can engage with. So please drop in the chat box information about you, and then I'll be going there from time to time to engage from the information you have dropped. So I expect everyone to share a little bit about themselves and what they expect to take away from this session, and what are those things that make you happy when you want to have fun? How do you go about having fun? Okay, so our objectives for today around these bullet points, to throw more light on the concept of employee engagement. What exactly does it mean? And then how do we strengthen employee experience? Because you can't engage. Engagement and experience are brothers and sisters. It's the sum of the experiences that results in engagement or disengagement, okay? In the course of managing employee, issues around employee relations is also very important. So how do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with employment issues? So we are going to be touching a little bit about, some relevant labor laws, and then how to manage employee relation issues. We're also going to look at, how, your HR practices should align with legal requirements, because we also don't want to be in the wrong when it comes to particularly the labor law. So the way you manage and relate with the employees, there must be an alignment with the provisions of the law, because that's also another ground for disengagement when employees feel cheated. All right, and then we'll look at talent acquisition. Engagement starts with hiring right. Okay, if you don't hire right, then you've made the fundamental problem, created a fundamental problem. There's nothing to build on when you don't hire right. And then what are the factors influencing employee retention? And then what are the strategies, right, we can adopt to ensure we have satisfied employees and we build loyalty? So our conversation will be around these key objectives. So the concept of employee engagement, what exactly is it about? Employee engagement in layman terms is how employees feel, all right, about the work environment, about the place they work. It is that connection employees have to their jobs, all right? When you say an employee is engaged, that means the employee is going far beyond the JD. The employee, can jump if the boss say jump from, a certain height. It can ask you, so how far should I jump? All right. So that extra employee brings to the workplace without expecting anything. They are just happy to do it. All right. That is what it means when you say you have an engaged employee. All right. That person that wants to put in the extra, that wants to do more. Right. That is what it means to be engaged. And related to that, if you see under the section where I put employee engagement, I intentionally put that experience. You can see experience in front of feel. Employee engagement is the extent to which employees feel, and in front of feel is experience. All right. The way I feel is the experience I have within the work environment. And that is why employee experience is a key factor, all right, in determining engagement. And when we talk about experience, what are we saying? We are talking about the sum of interactions and perceptions during employment. All right. Academic to Innovate HR, they said where there's positive employee experience, it leads to 16 times higher employee engagement. All right. So employee experience talks about the environment, the tools, the culture, all right. Things that you've made available to make that work environment conducive. While engagement is what you do to measure, all right? Engagement now measures, all right, the outcome of all those things that have been put in place, all right? So that is why there's a strong link between experience and engagement. Experience is what results into engagement. If my experience within the work environment is not positive, then I'm going to be disengaged. All right. So there's a strong connection between those two phenomena. All right. So moving on from there. So this thing we call experience, what are the things we need to do, to ensure that it's strengthened within the environment? A dimension to experience, or the building block on which experience is built, all right, is built on is the culture, all right? When they say work culture, that's the sum total of how we do things around here. That's the culture of the environment of the organization, how we do things around here. So if the way you do things within your environment is not positive, people can't have a positive experience. All right. So in strengthening your culture and building an employee experience, the first and foremost thing is, all those things we develop and we put on our website and we put on our walls, in the reception, we need to actualize it and bring it into practical terms. So articulate and communicate the core values, which is the foundation on which culture is built. So don't just leave those wonderful core values, respect, professionalism, communication, relationship. Don't just leave them, on the website or on your screensavers or on the reception wall. There has to be a living experience of those core values. So that's why sometimes in most organizations you have your monthly knowledge sharing sessions where you articulate and remind people this is what respect means here. This is what professionalism means here. This is what integrity means here. And so there's a constant reminder, so that their behaviors can be shaped by those core values. And a very important dimension to this communication bit is also to recognize people who live it. All right, create a system where people who demonstrate those core values are recognized and rewarded. You have all this employee of the month programs, employee of the year program, all those initiatives are directed at, people who symbolize the behavior we want, people who demonstrate the core values, bringing them out, showing them as role models to others. All right. So creating a reward and recognition system, for people who demonstrate the core values, who amplify your culture is another way to improve experience. And of course, when it comes to fairness and equality, when you start a business, the chances are that, in the course of employment, you have a lot of friends and families, who you hire into the workplace. And, based on that, some people may have more access to you than the others, So when we encourage all those dynamics within the work environment and somebody feels treated better than the other people. Remember, employees, they form alliances, all right? They talk to one another. When any employee, sees any indication of, inequity, all right, or unfairness in the way issues are dealt with, of course, you are kicking out, engagement, and then the experience is going to be contaminated. So a system where there's fairness, there's equality is very important. And underlying all this is listening to employee needs and concerns. That is why, most organizations have what you call employee engagement survey, employee experience. People deploy surveys, some do it twice a year, some do it annually, just to get, pulse check, all right, just to get feedback from employees on what they think about the work environment, how their experience has been. And some even go all the way to have, these open door policies where, from time to time, business owners, executive management call employees around them and say, talk to me. How has your experience been here? Most times things we do when people are leaving, what you call exit interview, all right? Most organizations have flipped it over that we shouldn't be waiting till somebody has resigned to now say we're doing exit interview to find out, why did you resign? What went wrong? Some organizations have flipped it over and they conduct what you call stay interviews from time to time. Stay interviews. So this person is still a staff, hasn't resigned. But I want to find out from him, if you're going to leave this place, what will make you leave? All right. And if you have stayed this long, what are the things that has made you stay this long? So that can reinforce, the good practices. And the ones that need improvement, that gives me, an idea, an indication of what needs to be improved. So creating avenues to listen to employees and not doing damage control. Exit interview is likely damage control, even though it can help you, against, whatever the employer is complaining about. It serves as a data point also to improve your processes. But before that person leaves, before that top talent resigns, all right, create platforms or avenues where you can engage and listen to them. And of course, number 5, there's a saying that people don't leave organizations, they leave their managers. So the manager is a person that, determines, the experience that you have in an organization. That's the first point of call before the larger organization. Some people stay long in an organization, even though maybe the entire climate is not that positive, but the person they work with, there's a loyalty, there's a commitment they've developed as a result of that line manager, who has, exceptionally good character and treats them well. All right. So your managers, it's important that you train them and they reflect your core values because that is what they'll be transferring to their direct reports. So help managers engage their teams more effectively. Going on from here, we're going to be looking at, I talked about employee relations, how we deal with issues, when issues come up within the environment, how do we resolve those issues? How do we ensure that we are in the right, especially when it comes to the labor law in handling issues within the work environment? So when we say employee relation, what exactly, does employee relations mean? Basically, it means the governing the employer relationship to form mutual respect, trust, and appreciation. All right. Employee relations are those activities that govern the employer-employer relationship to build respect, to build trust and appreciation. Employee relation is also how to build a strong company culture and healthy work environment. All these things determine how we relate and deal with employee issues, is a strong foundation for our culture and building a healthy work environment. It's also a platform to advocate for employees, supporting them and addressing their concerns and conflict issues as they rise up. All right. So in other words, employee relations cover everything around contractual, terms, the physical and emotional dimensions of the employee and employer relationship. All right. So looking at some of the things that we deal with in course of, when you talk of employee relations, things around workplace conflict, when, there are disagreements within work environment, how do we address them? Do we have a grievance procedure in place? Your employee onboarding, when people join your organization, do you have an onboarding plan for them, or the person just goes right onto his desk and the person is left to either sink or swim? All right. Do you have a structured onboarding program where the person learns about the business, learns about your culture, your core values, all right, and the different elements of the business? Do you have a structured onboarding program? The labor relations, these are things around, dispute resolution. Those who, especially those who have unionized environment, all right, agreeing to terms, negotiations here and there. But within the context of a smaller work environment, it's also important that, we create that platform, like I said earlier, for engagement, where people can speak up, create an environment where people are free to speak up, all right, so that issues are resolved in an effective way. And of course, very important is safety within the work environment. What are the things we've put in place to ensure that the workplace is safe for everyone, the workplace is healthy for everyone, all right, little things around safety issues, all right, safety talk, all right, those are, very important elements of employee relations. And absenteeism, when someone doesn't show up at work, how do you manage it? How do you deal with it? All right, do you have policies in place, to treat disciplinary issues, all right, so that things are not just done by knee-jerk approach, all right, setting up policies to guide conduct and misconduct within the work environment, absenteeism, insubordination, employee misconduct, all right, all these things, when they come up, how do we deal with them? Do we have policies guiding our actions? All right, which is part of what you must share with them, new employees when they resume during your onboarding process. This is our policy for discipline. These are our policy. If you have grievances, this is how to go about it. So all these policies will spell out, every act of misconduct and what the consequences are. All right. So it is important that this is communicated clearly. So nobody feels I was treated, I was mistreated, or I was dealt with the wrong hand of law or sanction. All right. Because once we communicate this clearly, everybody is at peace and they know what the expectations are. And of course, well-being of an employee. It's important we pay practical attention to this because when it comes to health matters, if an employee, if you don't care about, whether the person is feeling fine, or the person is not feeling fine, you don't have any plans in place, to take care of well-being, it's going to impact on experience and ultimately engagement. All right. So these are the, some of the dynamics when it comes to employee relations that we need to take care of so as to improve the experience in the workplace. Moving on from there, so what are the strategies, to ensure that you have a employee relations that is effective? All right. The first thing is honest communication, like I said earlier on, transparency. All right. The way I treat A is also the way I treat B. All the policies are clearly stated. Everybody knows the sanction grade. Everybody knows the acceptable behavior. Everybody knows what the consequences for non-performance. Everybody knows what the performance expectations are. So this honest communication through policies, procedures must be put in place. And of course, trust, building that culture of trust. And trust starts with equity, okay? Once I know that whatever I'm dealt with is what applies to all, I'm not going to be treated based on the way I look or where I come from or who I know in the organization. All right, helping employee to have some level of trust in the system. All right, so it's first about building those systems. When you build the system, then working with the systems you build. Don't do things outside the systems you build. And investment in your people. All right, particularly a lot of people, you see them decide that I want to leave an organization, and you hear them I do a lot of recruitment, and especially those that have short stints that probably want to leave the organization after 1 year or less. And I say, why are you leaving? It's rather a short stay. And you hear things around, it is what I've brought into the organization that I've been using to do the job. All right. I'm not learning anything. There's no opportunity for growth. There's no opportunity for development. All right. So organizations that invest in their people, all right, maintain good relations, maintain good experience, and ultimately engagement. Everything about legal aspect of managing people, it's important that we are mindful of them because that will aid how we'll engage employees, especially when there are issues of disagreement. So we don't do things that are contrary to the provisions of the law. And of course, having policies in place like I talked earlier on, your vision, your mission, articulating it and letting them know. And of course, a recognition program, like I said earlier on, and a culture that promotes diversity. All right. Some organizations deliberately, when it comes to recruitment, they will say, amongst the candidates selected, we must have a diversified pool. And that's why most times they say, advertise through different media so that we have a diversified pool. We don't just want to be known as a Igbo company or Hausa company or Yoruba company. I want to have a diversified pool. Or we don't just want to be seen as just a female workplace or just dominantly male workplace. As much as possible, have some diversity in the mix of the work environment because each gender, each ethnic group brings something different to the table. All right, so that also improves the level of engagement, and of course monitor how employee relations issues are treated to ensure that there's equity. All right, just very quickly look at some legal aspects of employee relations, your employment contract when you hire, what are the contents of the employment contract, wages and overtime issues, discrimination, workplace safety, termination, all these things add up to the experience employees have within the environment, which ultimately leads to engagement. So we'll touch very briefly on some of these elements. When it comes to contract, there are some things that the labor law expects you to have in every employment contract. All right, the name of the employer, all right, the location, where the person is going to be working, name and address of the worker, the date the employment is going to kick off, the nature of the employment. Is it full-time? Is it contract? Is it part-time? What is the nature? Is it internship? All right. If it's a contract, how long is it? Is it 6 months? Is it 1 year? And the specific date when that contract expires. Because all these things, are the issues around employee relations, which also adds up to experience. When contracts are not clear, and then, things happen and the employee feels cheated, all right, just because there's no clarity in the communication. All right. So notice period required. If I'm going to resign, what is the notice period expected of me? Is it a 1 month notice? Is it a 2 month notice? All right. And if you're also terminating me, the same must apply. All right. So notice period, or payment in lieu. That's always what is expected. If I'm not going to be giving notice, I want to leave immediately, then that means I'm owing the company. I must pay for that notice period. So all those things should be clearly stated in the employment contract. And of course, the compensation, all right? How much am I going to be paid? What's the frequency of payment, all right? When should I expect the payment? The hours of work, standard hours of work in Nigeria is 8 hours of work. It must be clearly stated. How will public holidays be treated? If I have weekend work, all these things needs to be clearly stated. If I'm going to be working extra hours, how will that be compensated in terms of overtime, days off, and all that? The dates to which the necessarily there's a change in time. So it must also include that, from time to time, if there's any change, in the term spelled here, it's going to be communicated through XYZ means, just to show that in case there's any change in the terms of engagement, there will be a formal communication, not something you've agreed with on the offer and person has signed off and decided at will to make adjustment without engagement. You're treading on the wrong path. So it's very, very important. And, that contract must be signed by the employee and the employer, all right? And each person must have a copy of the contract. Another dimension to that is if you're hiring expatriates also, there are things required legally for hiring of expats. Things around expatriate quota, every organization has an expatriate quota that is applicable to them. So from engaging Federal Ministry of Interior or all these consultants, there are consultants around, expatriate migration. All right, so ensure that, the expatriate quota allotted to you is what you're following through. And in terms of work permits, all right, you ensure that the work permit, the date on it, if it's expired, you need to renew it. So for expatriate workers, there's a provision in the Nigerian law, from Ministry of Interior, that we need to follow as employers so as to be on the right side of the law. Okay? So other elements of employment contract are around wages and overtime. As far as we know, in 2024, the minimum wage was increased to 70,000 naira for Nigerian workers. Employers that have less than 25 employees are, however, exempt. But as much as possible, if you want to attract talent as much as possible, you are to try to measure up, even if you have less than 25 employees, to measure up at least to the minimum wage. All right. So in engaging employees, are you adhering to this provision in terms of the minimum wage law in Nigeria? And also over time, all right, the International Labour Organization puts a peg of finality on work hours and affirmed 8 hours work day. So standard work days is 8 hours, okay? All right, so if you're going to engage somebody beyond 8 hours, a minimum from 1 hour after, overtime start counting if you're engaging the person beyond 1 hour after the 8 hours. All right, so there's no fixed rate on overtime. Most organizations decide to peg it at a certain amount, especially for employees who are, blue-collar jobs, people who do manual activities. So most times you find that some organizations peg it that, if you're doing overtime, this is a fixed rate we're going to be paying, as long as it is agreed by both parties. But in standard practice, you find it that they make it an element of your salary. So your basic salary, the hourly rate under your basic salary, times the number of hours you work as overtime, is always paid as overtime. So it's important that we are mindful of it when people need to work beyond the standard work hours. And when it comes to deduction, as far as I know right now, the employer has no right to deduct salary. The labor law doesn't permit you to deduct salary. So you find, especially most small businesses, you didn't come to work today, they will deduct the day you didn't come to work from your salary. You are doing something against the law. You are not permitted to touch, employees' wage. All right. So if an employee has done something wrong, that is why you should have your disciplinary policy process in place and the sanction grid. So query, warning letters, suspension, termination. There's a progression to discipline. So stick with that. But illicitly just entering into somebody's salary and deciding I'm deducting 5 days, I'm deducting 2 days is not permitted by law. So we need to be mindful of this also. And then, of course, extended by extension, deductions. Like I said earlier, some people, have good policies around loans, salary advance. All right, an employer has requested for loan or salary advance and given to that employee. If you are given any loan or salary advance, it is required that, the person monthly deduction, in terms of paying that money back, shouldn't be more than 1/3. All right. So you need to be mindful that the deduction or repayment plan, what is going to be deducted on a monthly basis, should not be more than 1/3 of the person's salary. All right. Because at the end of the day, it should be a living wage. Anything beyond 1/3, the fact that the person may not be able to live sustainably, on that salary. So it's important that, when we are doing loans and, developing repayment plans, we are mindful that deduction should not be more than the 1/3 of the salary on a monthly basis. Things around discrimination, we also need to be mindful of because all this contribute to employee experience. All right. The boss is a Yoruba man, so all the Yoruba people are treated in a certain way. The boss is from Igbo, so the Igbo people, or it's only just Igbo people everywhere, or if you want to get her, just send an Igbo person to her. Things that can look around discrimination, we need to avoid it. And of course, issues of sexual harassment within the work environment, we should discourage it at all costs and give opportunity for people to speak up. All right, let it be known boldly that, if you're facing any form of harassment, this is the channel, all right, you can complain to. This is the avenue you can complain to. We need to create those platforms, within the work environment because all this has effect on the experience and ultimately engagement. And safety within the work environment, all right, it's very important. It's a statutory requirement that, the least thing we can have is to have a first aid box, all right, and probably somebody who is in charge of safety within the work environment. So if there are little slips within the workplace, how do you treat it? Somebody falls, somebody, drills, if there's a fire outbreak, where do we run to? I mean, recently we all heard about, what happened on Lagos Island, where, there was a fire outbreak and employees were attempting to jump out of the window and, all sorts of mishaps, happened through that process. So, having a safety policy and, how do we treat emergencies is very important because, like we said, all this adds to employee experience. So different industries have the safety regulations around them. So depending on the industry you operate in, it's good to understand what are the safety regulations within that industry so that you can abide by them. And when it's time to say bye-bye to employees, another very important part of engagement is how we terminate, how we end relationships. All right. If we don't stand by the terms of termination, the terms of resignation, and we let emotions take over, we're going to ruin the experience. And ultimately, all that information, the ones that are still remaining in the system, they are looking at how the last person that left was treated. And they're also, developing the mindset about the organization. And you see that some organizations, when I worked at PwC, part of what PwC did, they have an alumni program. So because you've left our organization, we still see you as an ambassador. All right. So it's important, how we treat you, as you exit our organization, because you are taking the name of that organization out there. We've seen instances of an ex-employee bringing back business, an ex-employee, promoting your business. So termination shouldn't be like, severing a relationship. It shouldn't be the end of a relationship. All right. That person has chosen to move on to other things, and that relationship needs to be maintained properly. All right. So everything around terminal benefits, dictated in the contract should be paid on the last working day of the month. All right, the last day that person is leaving the organization, everything in internal benefit must be paid. And everything around the type of termination, whether it's redundancy, they must, in your clause, you should have a clause for redundancy. If this business decides to liquidate, or there's a takeover, or we can no longer, run this business, employees remaining, this is what we will do. All right, this is what we pay them as severance package, to ease them out of the system. So we need to have those kind of things in place. Notice period, all right? Is it a 1 month notice? Is it a 2 month notice? It needs to be clearly stated. And, we need to abide by those provisions. And, conditions for termination. Depending on how bad the employer feels, you can decide, to fire indiscriminately. But the National Industrial Court has ruled that no employer should terminate the appointment of an employee unless there's a valid reason. All right. So, and when you say valid reason, that means you must have documentation to show this. You must have shown that, there's a trail. So that's why, I always tell business owners, I think the documentation part is always the most difficult. Learning to give queries, learning to give warnings, and documenting them is important. Because, when you need to make that decision of, now you can, the person will not just think, my boss just has, just as a wave, his head touch, say, my boss, his head can touch anytime. No, it's not about the head of the boss touching. It's about a process in place. All right. There's a structured approach to discipline, and I've gone through that entire process. So I can tell you to leave at this point without anybody thinking, I did it out of emotions, or I'm just unnecessarily. Some people will hire people and there's even no termination letter. They just say, leave, don't come back here, So we need to put all those structures in place to ensure that the experience of the current workforce and those who leave, all right, is positive about the work environment. Okay, I talked about talent acquisition. The way we hire, has a long way it goes a long way in determining retention, because if you don't hire right, also the ability to retain is also going to be faulted, because you need to get the right people first. If you don't get the right people, then retention will be a challenge. So putting a structure to our recruitment process is also very important. Okay, that involves putting out adverts and ensuring we have a pool of applicants so that we can get the best from the pool. Referral is one way of attracting talent. It shouldn't be the only way. All right. So because we are limiting the chances of getting the best if it's just referral we are using. All right. So there are various social media platforms where we can put up our advert. There are various groups, we belong to. The LinkedIn is there. All right. To ensure that we have, a large pool of people to attract. And in the process of, sourcing, we're also projecting our brand. All right. That's also an opportunity for people to know about the business, about what we do. All right. So some people get, they get glued to an organization only from even recruitment stage. All right. The way the recruitment was structured, the interview process. All right. It's not that you call somebody for interview. The person is in the waiting room, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. The person has not been admitted, and you didn't get back to the person and say, sorry, there has been an adjustment to the interview time. Please join back 30 minutes or join back 45 minutes. The person is just waiting endlessly. When we talk of experience, it starts from there. When we talk of engagement, it starts from there. From there, somebody can decide, this is not somewhere I want to stay. All right. So it's very important that, the way our recruitment process works, we follow, best practice as much as possible in the course of recruitment, documenting the interview outcome. All right. How we decide on salary, what are the things we want to measure, the things we want to assess during the interview, having some documentation around it also goes a long way in making our recruitment process standardized. So our talent attraction strategy is very important. All right. Attraction involves building a strong employer brand and a strong value proposition for employees. In the course of if you read some job adverts, by the time they put all the branding things, the things you can benefit from joining them, it's not it used to be an employer market before. Now it's also about the employee, wooing and, trying to get the attention of the best people in the market. All right. So it's all about how you position yourself and how you communicate your brand. So what you call EVP, all right, is very important. That value proposition you put in your recruitment, your communication is very important in helping you attract the best. So it is very important that, in the course of sourcing, we do things to attract, the best within the market. And of course, like I said earlier on, your selection process, all right, ensuring you have a job description. A basic thing as job description, most people don't have. So somebody who resumes and, it just enters the market and it just works based on instruction, do this, do that. Document, the responsibilities for that role. What is the job title? What are the responsibilities? So that person knows this is what is expected of me, and that dovetails into performance. All right. So, having a performance management system where the person is bound by what is written in that JD, all right, you can decide that performance management will be done depending on the size of your operation. Some do it quarterly, some do it monthly, some do it twice a year, and some do it annually, depending on how big the organization is. All right. So all those things helps to ensure that, you retain the right people and you reward them accordingly, because reward is another dimension to engagement. When people don't get the reward that befits what they are doing, they get disengaged. And, most employers also said, what is he even doing? Why should I increase salary? Are you measuring its outcome? Is there a performance management system in place for you to measure his contribution so that he also knows, where he's falling short, all right, of the expectation? So that is very important. Okay, so your talent acquisition strategy, you can decide to build. Build is people who are already in the system, you develop them. That's a strategy. So I have quite a number of young people who are still developing their career, and I continue to invest in them so that they can step on to higher responsibility. That's the building strategy. Then the buying strategy is, somebody who has all the experience, who, has all the exposure. I'm looking for the skills I'm looking for. I buy. So yeah, I pay, more to get that person. So buying is another strategy. Another strategy is, using all these contracts. I develop a scheme, I develop a program where people come in to learn skills, all right? They learn skills, and through that, I can, move them into the employment system, all right? So some organizations have the leadership program, learning skills, upskilling program, which they can use to transit talent in the system and borrow. Yes, you can also borrow. You use consultants, bringing people on short-term projects to help you, work on a specific project for a particular time. So depending on what you want to achieve per time, you can adopt any of these strategies to your talent acquisition process. But by and large, the experience all these people have, engaging with your brand is very important. Okay, so we are moving to the end of the conversation. Part of the experience, like I said, is your onboarding. When you hire that person, within the first 30, 60, 90 days, what's the plan? All right. What are the things you've put in place to help the person settle in? Because we are talking of experience, we are talking of engagement, we are talking of retention. You want the person to stay. Then your onboarding plan must also be tight. The things you need to know about the culture, our products, scheduled time to meet with your line manager to track how you're doing, how you're settling in. What are your pain points? Giving opportunity to know that, within the first 30 days, there are things you map out. Within the next 60 days, there are things you map out around feedback, how work is going. And last working day, the person should have settled into a large extent, and the person should be able to run, with little or no assistance. All right. So you need to track the person's journey within the first 90 days of the employment, and that contributes to the person's experience and your employer brand. So the concluding part is specific retention strategies that we can adopt. Number one is competency-based hiring. This takes us back to talent acquisition strategy. when you're hiring, please identify the skills and competencies, and those are the questions you should be asking. Like I said, some people from interview stage, the candidate is already thinking, do I want to work in this kind of place? I don't think I want to stay here. Because you're asking questions that don't have any bearing with the job. All right. How many children do you have? Questions that don't have any relationship with the job. Focus on the competencies during the interview. Focus on the skills during the interview. All right. So you don't want to ask questions that are, unnecessarily, protruding to other people's personal affairs. It is about the job. It is about the competency and the skill the person has. So competency-based hiring is one place to attract and retain talent. Number two is the person they will be reporting to. Have you developed your team leaders? Have you developed your supervisors in terms of people management? I was talking with a client yesterday. They developed a competency framework, and the next thing we told them is you need to develop your first line leaders, because if they don't know what to do, they don't know how to manage people, all these things you're putting in place will not work, because they are the first point of call with your employees. All right. So that's why you have some guy having a structured leadership development program, things around people management, things around ethics, things around, the core values of the organization. If they don't demonstrate it, then it is difficult for you to see it in the people that report to them. And of course, a career management framework. This is a very important element of retention. If I stay here for another 5 days, what are my prospects? Where am I going? Is there a ladder? What's the next level? What's the next growth pattern for me here? If we haven't taken time to explain that, then the person will just stay there for a short period. I think there's no growth opportunity here. Why should I stay? All right. So having a career management framework, no matter how small it is, to show progression, the years of experience, the skills, across each level of growth. And of course, it comes with salary structure with it. Having something in place, helps us to retain talent. And of course, your value proposition, like I said, when I'm bringing them in, what are the things I'm selling to them? Work-life balance, your culture, creating an avenue for people to speak up, all right? An environment where people are not afraid, things around health benefits, little benefits that are even statutory, all right, making some efforts to put those things in place. Why should this person come and work for me? That's a question you should ask. If you can't answer that question, then you don't have a value proposition. So you need to sit down and craft one. Why should these people choose our company above any other company? And your culture, like I said, culture experience. How do you do things around here? How do you deal with conflict issues? How do you prioritize well-being? What do you do around team bonding? All right. Do you create avenues for team bonding? All right. All those things, determine culture. Is the boss high up there and nobody can access the boss? Or there's an open door policy where everybody's, free to speak. Those are the elements of culture. And of course, opportunity to be developed. I shared an example of somebody who decided I can't stay here because there's no development. So no matter how small, opportunity for people to learn new skills. Otherwise, it is the residual knowledge they have that they'll be using to deliver on the job. And you have competitors out there that are doing great things. So if you don't develop your workforce, how do you want to stand in the market, all right, in the face of competition? So it benefits you more to, to invest in training so that training can translate to output and productivity in the work environment. So training is a very important element of retention. Fair compensation, like I said, from time to time, organizations do compensation benchmarking just to see within this industry I am. Where am I? Am I the one paying the least? Am I in the middle? Am I the one leading? Just taking a sample of people within your industry, know what they pay. So that will help you make adjustments to your salary structure from time to time. And of course, a system to recognize people who are outstanding, people who are living your values, creating a platform to recognize and showcase them and rewarding them with, no matter how small it is, just to show to people that we appreciate, and recognize good work and good behavior. All right. So in implementing any of this, conduct stay interviews, opportunity to hear from employees. Don't wait till they resign. From time to time, have structured discussions, what you call a stay interview. All right. What do you like about working here? All right. What do you think we can improve on? Getting those feedback from employee is very important. And, tracking your exits, looking at the exit patterns. Why are they leaving? If you see a recurrent reason, recurrent patterns, nail it in the board and deal with, that topic that comes often when people say, this is why I'm leaving, and encourage open communication between employees and managers and leaders. I've talked about this, develop speaker platform, town hall meeting, focus group sessions. All right, all these things are very important in ensuring we hear from our employees. So that is all for now. Thank you for your time. I'd like to know one thing you are taking away from today's training. One thing you are going to change, that is what you will leave behind. And the thing that taught you most during this experience, and then the questions you have. All right, so that's it from me. Thank you for listening and learning. I hope I'm not the only one in the room till now.
No, you're not. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. That was an amazing session. I wish everybody can just give Madam Tinuke a virtual clap or a virtual love somewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just want to say if you have questions, do you want to drop your questions on the chat so that we could read it, and then Tinuke could provide answers to you. But just to say that was a very, very insightful session. Thank you to everyone who has dropped the information on the page. Thank you, Damilola. Thank you to, I want to just see if I can pick up as fast as possible. Thank you. Thank you to Engineer Watunde. Thank you to Olawumi James. Do we have questions? Thank you to everyone who have dropped their names here. Thank you, Damilola, for clapping. We really appreciate. So are there questions? If we have questions, we would like to have them. Thank you, Asiudepo, for your comments. Tinuke, someone says, how do you manage conflict and personal differences that leads to issues at the workplace? Do you want to quickly respond to that, Tinuke?
All right, yes, I want to. Okay, so when it comes to conflict resolution, you need to have a system in place where you give room for both parties to express what the disagreement is. And like I said earlier on, your core values undermine how issues are resolved. All right, if you have a culture of respect, if you have a culture of, managing relationships within the work environment and with the external stakeholders, you create that platform where both parties express, what happened. And, as the leader, you should be able to discern the person who has been the aggressive one or who has, aided or, made that thing escalate to the level it is. All right. So when you hear from them separately, don't bring the two of them together. You hear from them individually. And from your conversation with the two of them, you should be able to discern who was in the wrong and point the person in direction of what the person did wrong. So call the person and let him know this is how you have heard. And let him meet the other person and apologize. All right. It's very important that that takes place. Once you've identified who is in the wrong. If that issue of disagreement happens again the next time, then you want to escalate your disciplinary process into an outright query to explain what happened. So now people will now start documenting. So they now know, in terms of seriousness, there are some things we don't conduct here. But, in early instances is to mediate, and have conversations with both parties and identify who has hurt, somebody who has done something that is not in alignment with your core values, and point him to it and get him to apologize and reconcile with the other person. I hope that answers your question.
I think from my end, I think that was quite insightful, Tinuke. Thank you. Damilola, I believe that answers your question. If it does, just give a thumbs up, either in the chat space. If you still need more clarification, okay, so I have a second question still from Damilola. So it says, how do you manage biases and sarcasm, if I'm correct? Or is it sarcasm? Okay, sarcasm. How do you manage biases and sarcasm from colleagues at the workplace? How do you manage biases and sarcasm from colleagues at the workplace? Tinuke, do you want to go ahead, please?
So when it comes to bias, organizations are always deliberate in dealing with bias in the work environment. So things around your interview process, the way departments are structured. So when interview is going on, for example, if it is only two men, they will look for a woman to join them so that any bias that comes from men, the woman is also in there, to counter that bias. So within teams, you need to, if there are two Yorubas and, the decision can favor Yoruba person, there are two Igbos very can favor, that's why I said DEI, I talked about part of things you can do to ensure engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, so don't let any population be, the population within a decision-making body be only tilted towards a certain gender or a certain tribe, all right? As much as possible, let there be a mix so that, it's not, this person did not make this decision because it's female, or this person didn't make it because it's male. All right, having that, fusion of, different genders, different ethnic groups, bringing them together so it can counter whatever bias we all bring to the table is very important, especially when it involves making decisions. So that is one. But at least your second question, I want to believe it's maybe somebody making funny remarks. Somebody is making sarcastic comments, so within the organization, policies around, how we deal with one another. If somebody harassment, probably this can tilt more towards harassment, because if I look within the context of workplace policy, this most likely will be put under, the harassment. So when somebody, if you feel you are being harassed, constantly by a fellow employee, your organization have a process in place to express that grievance and to discuss it so that the person can be called to order. All right. So most organizations put all these things in place. So you go and escalate the matter to the appropriate authority and say, this has been happening, so it's not just a one-off thing. You must have seen a pattern for you to establish that this person is just being sarcastic towards me. So that should be reported to the appropriate channel, and whatever sanctions in place to correct that will be applied. So these are some of the things we need to put in place under bullying, harassment, and so on within the work environment.
Thank you, Tinuke. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I think there aren't any more questions. We just want to say thank you to Tinuke. Tinuke, I don't know if you have any closing word, just to round up the session. And we hope we can see you again some other time. This was quite insightful.
Absolutely. I look forward to further interactions with NSTF. It was a pleasure doing this. And I hope our business owners, with these few tips I've shared, will have a more engaged workforce, and we can apply some of these things, into our work processes, managing our employees so that we can attract the best talent and also retain them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget that you can always reach out to the LSCTF team. My name is Ayobami. I'm holding in for Boluwatife and Tayo today. We're always here to hold you for our loan program and every other intervention that we need. Are you looking for how to access the LASFA, the LASHMA? We also provide CAC registration for businesses and see how we can support you to formalize essentially. So please don't fail to reach out to us at any point in time for whatever support you need in terms of assessing any of LSCTF intervention. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Please invite your friends next time. Let's have a full house. Let's make it bigger. This is very, very rich content. We should make sure that many more people in Lagos State have access to it. Please don't forget to fill the survey. It is quite important because it helps us to know how best we can help you going forward and how we can link you to other intervention that the fund might be executing. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely, lovely, lovely afternoon. Bye, and thank you, Tineke. Damdola, yes, that feedback is taken. We'll do that.